For hundreds of years, the Vikings sailed across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. They crossed the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and rivers that cut deep into foreign lands. They did this on open wooden ships with no roof, no walls, and no protection from the wind or the cold. Dozens of men lived on those ships together for weeks at a time. They ate, slept, and worked in the same small space. They shared food, shared water, and shared air. By every reasonable measure, those ships should have been floating graves. Disease should have torn through those crews fast and without mercy. But it did not. The Vikings never got sick in numbers that stopped them. They kept sailing. They kept raiding and trading. They reached Iceland, then Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever set sail. The question that historians and researchers have spent years trying to answer is a simple one. Why did the Vikings never get sick when the conditions they lived in should have made disease almost certain? To understand why the Vikings never got sick, it helps to look at what was happening to the rest of the world during the same period. Medieval Europe was not a healthy place. Cities were growing faster than anyone knew how to manage. London, Paris, and Rome were packed with people living in tight quarters with no real system for dealing with human waste. When people needed to relieve themselves, they used buckets called chamber pots, and then they threw the contents out of their windows and into the streets below. There were open drains running alongside market stalls where people bought their food. Animals were slaughtered in the same streets where children played. Rats moved freely through homes, through food stores, and through every corner of every city. The water that people drank came from wells and rivers that were fed by the same ground that absorbed all the waste from those streets. Europe was dying slowly, day by day, one sick person at a time. And the people in power had no real understanding of why. The soldiers of medieval Europe suffered just as badly as the civilians who stayed at home. During the Crusades, when European armies traveled by ship to fight in the Holy Land, disease was their most dangerous enemy. Those ships were built very differently from Viking longships. They had enclosed decks below the waterline where cargo and soldiers were packed together. There was almost no fresh air moving through those spaces. Waste collected in the bottom of the ship in standing water that had nowhere to go. Men who had survived battles and long marches died below deck from sickness before they ever reached their destination. During the Third Crusade, more soldiers died from disease on those ships than died fighting the enemy. The ships themselves were killing the armies they were supposed to carry. Yet the leaders of those armies never solved the problem. Generation after generation, they built the same kinds of ships, and generation after generation, the same diseases followed them across the sea. The Viking longship was a completely different kind of vessel. It was long and narrow, built low to the water. The gap between the deck and the surface of the sea was small enough that a man standing at the side of the ship could reach down and touch the water without leaning very far. This design was made for speed and flexibility, and it turned out to have an enormous benefit that the shipbuilders may not have fully understood. Human waste went overboard immediately. Nothing accumulated. Nothing sat still long enough to breed bacteria in large numbers. The moving saltwater of the open ocean killed harmful organisms almost as soon as they hit the surface. There was no enclosed space below the deck for waste to collect. There were no dark corners where bacteria could multiply quietly over days and weeks. The ship was essentially self-cleaning because the ocean itself did the cleaning. Every wave that broke against the hull washed away what needed to be washed away. The hull of the Viking longship had another quality that turned out to be medically important, even if no one at the time would have described it in medical terms. The wooden planks that made up the sides of the ship overlapped each other and were sealed with tar and animal hair. But they were never perfectly watertight. Seawater seeped in constantly through small gaps in the wood. The crew bailed this water out regularly as part of their daily routine. What this meant in practice was that the floor of the ship was always being rinsed. Any food scraps, any spilled liquid, any organic material that dropped to the deck mixed with the incoming seawater and was scooped out and thrown overboard during the next round of bailing. The ship was being flushed by the ocean on a regular schedule. Compare this to the enclosed ships used by Crusader armies, where the water at the bottom of the hull was sealed in and allowed to sit still. That still water, mixed with waste and rotting organic material, became deeply toxic over time. Sailors called the resulting sickness bilge fever. It killed men slowly and painfully, and it never stopped being a problem for European navies, even centuries later. The water that the Vikings drank on their voyages was another key reason they never got sick the way European sailors did. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels turns dangerous within a few weeks. Bacteria grow in the dark interior of the wood. The water becomes a source of sickness rather than health. European navies feared their own water barrels almost as much as they feared enemy cannons because they knew that bad water could destroy a crew faster than any battle. The Vikings solved this problem without thinking of it as a solution. They simply preferred to drink weak beer and fermented sour milk rather than plain water. Both of these drinks were made through processes that involved heating and fermentation. Those processes, without anyone understanding the reason, killed the harmful bacteria that would have made the drinks dangerous. The Vikings chose these drinks because they liked the taste and because they were filling and gave energy during hard physical work. The result, which they never could have explained in scientific terms, was that they were protected from the waterborne diseases that killed so many other sailors throughout history. The Vikings also had a very different relationship with personal hygiene than most of their European neighbors. An Arab traveler and diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Norse traders on the Volga River in the year 921. He wrote down what he saw in detail because it surprised him greatly. He described men who washed themselves every single day, passing a shared bowl of water from one person to the next. He noted that they combed their hair carefully and paid attention to their appearance as a daily habit rather than an occasional luxury. A few centuries later, an English writer named John of Wallingford recorded his own observations about Viking settlers living in England. His complaint was that the Norse men who lived among the English bathed every Saturday and changed their clothes regularly. His concern was not about cleanliness itself. His concern was that English women found these clean, well-groomed men more attractive than the local men who paid less attention to such things. It is a remarkable piece of historical evidence. The Vikings were so noticeably clean compared to the people around them that it became a social and political issue. The graves of Viking men and women across Scandinavia, Britain, and Iceland have told the same story that those written accounts describe. Archaeological excavations have found that Viking burial sites consistently contain personal grooming tools. Bone combs, often carved with detailed patterns, are found alongside weapons and tools. Small metal tweezers and ear cleaning instruments made from bone and antler have been discovered at sites across the Viking world. These were not luxury items carried only by wealthy people. They were found in the graves of ordinary men and women too. The culture treated personal hygiene as something close to a daily obligation, as necessary and normal as eating or sleeping. These grooming tools were buried with the dead because the people doing the burying considered them important. They were part of how a person lived, not a minor detail. The Saturday bathing practice of the Vikings had a name that has survived all the way into modern language. The Old Norse word for washing day was lordag, and that word became Saturday in the modern Scandinavian languages. Every seventh day, regardless of weather, regardless of the season, regardless of where they were or what they were doing, Vikings bathed. During winter this meant heating water over a fire using wood that was scarce and valuable. During long voyages it sometimes meant washing with cold seawater at the first stretch of land they could reach. The habit did not change based on convenience. It was built deeply into the culture, which meant it did not require anyone to make a decision about it. It simply happened, the way breathing happens, because not doing it was not considered a real option. The daily combing was equally important, and the reason it mattered goes beyond simple cleanliness. Epidemic typhus is a disease caused by a bacterium that spreads through the feces of body lice. When lice feces get into a scratch or a cut in the skin, the bacteria enter the bloodstream and cause a serious and often fatal illness. Medieval armies lost enormous numbers of soldiers to typhus, not to enemy weapons. The disease moved through crowded, unsanitary military camps with tremendous speed. The Vikings, by combing their hair and beards every single day, physically removed lice before those lice had a chance to lay eggs and multiply. Weekly bathing disrupted the entire reproductive cycle of the parasite. The Vikings did not know that lice spread disease. They did not have any knowledge of bacteria or parasites in the way that modern medicine understands them. But generations of observation had taught their culture that people who kept themselves clean and groomed stayed healthier than people who did not. That knowledge was encoded into their daily habits so deeply that it operated automatically, without anyone having to explain the reason behind it. The network of harbors and stopping points that the Vikings maintained across their entire range of travel added another layer of protection. Over 200 harbor sites used by Viking sailors have been identified by historians, running from the coast of Norway all the way to Newfoundland in North America. These stopping points were roughly a day of sailing apart from each other. Every time a crew stopped and came ashore, the biological burden of shipboard life dispersed. Men went on to land. They relieved themselves on solid ground rather than on the ship. They washed their clothes in streams or rivers. They bathed in fresh water if it was available. They ate fresh food when they could find it. The ship itself sat empty and was washed by whatever rain or seawater came over the sides. By the time the crew reboarded and continued their journey, the ship was as clean as it was going to get, and the men were cleaner than they had been when they stopped. Social pressure among the crew of a Viking ship enforced these standards more effectively than any written rule could have. A longship carried between 30 and 60 men in a space barely wider than a modern car is long. Everyone could smell everyone else. Everyone could see the condition of every other person's hair and clothes. If one man was dirty or infested with lice, everyone on the ship was affected. There was no privacy, no separation, and no way for one person's poor hygiene to stay that person's private problem. It became everyone's problem immediately. This meant that the men around any individual enforcer of standards became the enforcers themselves. No one needed to appoint a hygiene officer or write regulations. The simple reality of shared space created accountability that was more constant and more effective than any law. In medieval Europe, the situation was almost perfectly opposite. Hygiene was considered a private matter, which meant it was often not considered at all. But more damaging than indifference was the fact that the medical authorities of medieval Europe actively told people that bathing was dangerous. The medical theory of the time held that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to enter the body. This was not a fringe belief held by a small number of people. It was mainstream medical opinion, taught in universities and repeated by physicians to their patients across the continent. People were encouraged to avoid bathing, especially warm bathing, as a matter of health. Kings scratched at their lice. Nobles who could afford any luxury they wanted chose not to bathe because their doctors told them not to. The same century in which Viking men were required by cultural tradition to bathe every Saturday, European men of wealth and power were avoiding water because their physicians had convinced them it would kill them. The consequence of this difference did not fully arrive until 1347, but when it came with a force that changed European civilization permanently. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rats. It spread through the unsanitary conditions of European cities with a speed that nothing could stop. Open sewers, contaminated wells, streets shared by humans and livestock, homes full of rats, cities packed with people who rarely bathed and whose lice and fleas moved freely from one person to the next, all of it had been building toward catastrophe for generations. Between 1347 and 1353, the plague killed an estimated 50 million people across Europe. In some regions, more than half the population died. Entire villages disappeared. Families were wiped out completely. The social structures that had taken centuries to build collapsed within months. The medical authorities who had told people not to bathe had no answer for what was happening. The governments that had never built proper sanitation systems had no tools to stop it. What makes the Viking story even more remarkable is that their system worked not because one person designed it, but because an entire culture agreed to live a certain way. There was no king who issued a bathing law. There was no physician who discovered the connection between lice and disease. There was no government that built a sanitation infrastructure and enforced its use. What existed instead was something far more durable than any law or institution. It was a shared set of values that every person in the community carried inside them from childhood. Viking children grew up watching their parents comb their hair every morning and bathe every Saturday. They grew up on ships where waste went overboard immediately and where the ocean kept everything clean. By the time those children were adults, the habits were not habits anymore. They were simply the way life worked. No one had to remind them. No one had to punish them for failing. The standards were maintained because everyone around them maintained the same standards, and because falling below those standards brought immediate social consequences in a world where reputation was everything. Europe was dying in part because it never built this kind of culture around health. It built cathedrals and castles and codes of law, but it never built the daily habits that keep people alive. The Vikings never got sick because they had built a system that protected them without requiring them to understand exactly why it worked. The open ship flushed itself. The preferred drinks happened to be safe from bacterial contamination. The Saturday bathing habit disrupted the diseases that moved through dirty skin and hair. The daily combing eliminated the parasites that spread some of the most dangerous illnesses of the medieval world. The harbor network gave the crew regular resets. The social pressure of living in close quarters enforced every single one of these practices without any authority needing to be involved. No element of this system was designed with modern scientific knowledge. All of it came from generations of observation, from habits that had been passed down because the people who followed them survived and the people who did not follow them often did not. Europe was dying because it had built cities and institutions without building a culture of health to go with them. The Vikings stayed alive because their culture had made health automatic. The lesson that history offers from this comparison is not complicated. The most powerful protection against disease has never been a single discovery or a single technology. It has always been the daily habits of ordinary people, practiced without thinking, passed down without explaining, and maintained without anyone needing to be reminded.